Welcome to the Element Q podcast. I'm your host, TJ Woodward, and I'm thrilled to have you join us for this empowering journey. Each week, we shine a light on the authors, thought leaders, therapists, coaches, and healers of all types who are making a difference in the LGBTQ plus community. Together, we honor those who came before us, the courageous and resilient trailblazers who stood for our rights and recognition. Their strength laid the foundation we stand on today. Here, we celebrate their legacy by diving into the stories, insights, and tools that inspire gentleness, healing, and transformation. So get ready to be uplifted and empowered. This is the Element Q podcast. I am so excited about today's guest, Janae Borrego, who is a therapist in private practice, the chief clinical officer of Rainbow Hill, which is an LGBTQ plus treatment program here in Los Angeles. We're going to have her incredible bio in the show notes. So right now, I just want to dive into this conversation. Janae, welcome to the show.
Oh my God. Thank you for having me. Congratulations on the podcast. Congratulations on branching out and developing a wonderful Element Q programming. I'm so excited to just share words with you today.
Oh my gosh, thank you. And when we were in the green room, which basically is just us chatting before the show starts, we were talking about what was wanting to emerge. And you came up with a term that I think is absolutely phenomenal. We often hear the conversation about intergenerational trauma. I think it's absolutely an important conversation. But you said, what about intergenerational joy and specifically intergenerational queer joy?
Right.
I've never heard anyone really talk about that. So let's do it. What comes up for you as we're sitting with this topic?
Yeah, my background is rooted in trauma work, and I don't even know how I ended up in that route, but I think, the world kind of pushed me into it. And I think when I work a lot with, LGBTQ community as well as the BIPOC community. Um, and, I think when we look at healing, right, we have this topic around intergenerational trauma, right? And yeah, that's really heavy and we work with that a lot. But I find that, you know, more specifically, as I've done a lot of work, I really leaned into like a lot of cultural work. And I found that it was so vital to like me and my healing journey to know history, all sides of history, like one, the sides where intergenerational trauma does exist because it gives us a larger perspective to what's going on and how we need to utilize our voices. But I think at the same time, kind of being able to go back and um, have history, positive history, representation has been the most healing thing, I think, for me personally. And I think to be able to bring into the room for the clients that I work with, right? And I think because we're shut out of that, right? Right now, our books are being taken away, and not just for queer folks, but just for all folks in general, right? And those knowledge is power, right? History, gives us a framework of where we've been and how we can access joy even in stressful times, right? So I think really empowering our folks through acknowledging that there is more than just trauma in our lives, right? We do need to access joy. We do need to access laughter and authenticity for ourselves as we kind of navigate a lot of the external stressors that this community deals with.
Wow, there is so much in what you just said that I want to dive more deeply
Sure.
into. And right out of the gate, I just want to acknowledge the importance of what you're saying, because I think a lot of times the narrative is the narrative of the trauma that has happened, which obviously is real, obviously wants to be addressed in one's healing. But
Mhm.
often we miss the opportunity to talk about the joy or to talk about the wonderful things in history. And as you said, history gets, told by one party quite often, or there's a narrative that we've been fed over and over and over again. And in my work, I know the power of the story, but it's not just the story, it's the
Yeah.
energy connected with the story. And in my own life, I was carrying so much shame. And when we look at, intersectionality, which is, a beautiful word that gets used a lot, but I know we're going to dive even more deeply in, because when we're in these different communities that merge, there are
Mhm.
so many layers to our stories, and the frequency of the one narrative of the people being pushed down and all of that's really important. I want to never negate a person's experience, but we also want to bring in this narrative and this energy of joy and happiness.
Mhm.
I just love what you're sharing. And when you are working with clients, and of course in your own journey, because in my experience, they're very, interconnected.
Sure,
What
yeah.
what do you see happening right now, and what do you hope for this intersectionality of BIPOC people, of LGBTQ
Yeah.
folks, of people living? I mean, there's so many layers.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, like you said, it's very complex, but I think kind of looking at all of it, like um the treatment approach versus how does culture play into this, right? Like obviously, a lot of marginalized are like I've heard this term of historically exploited communities, right? And um, and I hate in general, like I always like I never plan to be like political or everything. Like this is not what it's about. I'm not on either side. The reality is these things do affect people when we look at like on a neutral stance, like what affects people when they come to therapy, right? The reality is they take a lot of ownership for their anxiety, their depression, their stressors, almost as a character defect. Like, why can't I function in this world really well? Instead of asking, what is affecting me so much that I'm struggling, right? And, so those are more of the questions that I ask, right? Like, anxiety, depressions are just the symptoms of something kind of going on, right? And the reality is for a lot of these communities, there's a lot of minority stress going on right now. And that's a lot to navigate, right? So there is sort of the skill-based healing of that, like how do we manage the symptom? And then it's like, how do we resolve the root of this, right? And I think that one is exploring that there are these external stressors and bringing them to the table so people don't take ownership of the problem. But more specifically, like you said, broadening the lens in which this information is, or the funnel in which this information is coming through, right? Educationally in America, everything's very Eurocentric, and that's fine, but the reality is that's not the only route that people can heal, right? So being able to bring into like, well, how do you culturally manage healing and joy in life, because I once heard this term that like we generate 80% negative thoughts as a survival mechanism, right? Now imagine what continued trauma will do to that brain. You're just getting a landslide of or mudslide of negativity all day, right? So I always talk about how important it is for us to water our lawn, right? And for us to create joy, create positivity because we need that. And for me and my work and some of the folks that I work with, I think culture is a part of that. And acknowledging that have been many ways that we can access healing, joy, and the closer I grew to not just understanding the queer aspect of myself, but what it also meant to be a Chicana and how all of these intersect, there's amazing representation and visualizations of strength that I can utilize as a means of creating joy, accessing strength, and figuring out like how do we navigate this minority stress? Because I think we need that information as well. If you don't have information on how to hold strong, how are you going to navigate, the world around you?
Wow. And, I had the honor of facilitating a panel discussion that you were part of at Monema Monthly at Monema
Yeah.
Behavioral Health in San Diego. And you
Mhm.
talked about this, and I love that you're diving more deeply into it, that we have this opportunity to
Yeah.
do so, because there was something you said that at first, I'm just going to be fully transparent. At first, I had like this little inner
Mhm.
resistance to what you were saying. And then I'm like, isn't it interesting that I have that inner
Yeah.
resistance? And
Yeah.
what you said, which I think is really powerful, and I was talking with a therapist, and this therapist happened to be also Caucasian, and we were talking about the power of helping someone regulate and be in their body and calm. And you just very gently introduced an idea that, although of course that's important, and we're going to do that with our clients, there's also something that happens within certain communities that maybe that's not the only part of the process. And what I got from it, and the reason I'm kind of introducing this in this way is I want to hear more from you. But what I got from that is if we're only doing that, we might be bypassing, right? What we call a bypass, or like I'm not going to acknowledge that yes, there are these external stressors. There are things happening in culture. There are things that are passed down through story in generations and through trauma and through joy. And it's not one or the other. I'm hoping that you're going to dive more deeply in. It's how to honor that. And I'm thinking about my own journey as a gay man. There was at my age, not that we're going to talk about my age exactly, but there wasn't a lot of representation in the media other than a lot of negative representation. There was a lot of shame. And even though I had to work with my own shame, I also at some point in my journey had to work with this shame that happened through being gay men in the era that I grew up in.
Oh,
My
yeah.
great uncle who was gay but never talked about it, the shame I absorbed. So it is an individual healing process, but there is something in the collective. And I want to hear more from you about that because I was fascinated not only about what you were saying, but my little, ooh, isn't that interesting?
Yeah. Well, I come from a collectivist, culture, collectivism is not like we often hear it as being enmeshed, codependency. In my culture, those are maladaptive, harmful terms, right? They're not affirming terms, right? We can again, through maybe one specific style of learning and education system, you limit yourself to kind of really understanding how to uniquely support the individuals in which you're servicing, right? And for me, I think about what does it mean to be affirming, right? Especially at all points, right? Obviously, with the community, the LGBTQ community, it's acknowledging who they are from a very and affirming that and from a very strength based, like I think it's the most wonderful thing for you, right? um and also sort of affirming the lived experiences, right? I think it's very easy to and again, I never try to bring politics into it, but there's a gaslighting diminishing process that goes on, right? So to kind of systematically go away from that, I think is part of the clinical work and it's necessary to healing. And at the same token, it's kind of acknowledging, yeah, these things for trauma to exist is to acknowledge that there's oppressive trauma, there's political trauma, and it's historically connected to, again, historically exploited communities, right? So if I'm just focusing on anxiety, 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 and not taking a broader look at their life, that's going to be really challenging because again, I'm just managing the symptom. I'm not creating resolve. And I think for me, that's always been most helpful when I do a very biopsycho, social, even physical lens. I look at everything in regards to what are people using to fuel in their body? What are the narratives that they're speaking, right? And when you're looking at an individual, like you said, navigating shame and all of these things, right? As being a queer person, we really have to deconstruct that. And where does that shame come from, right? Because I come from indigenous cultures where, there's two-spirited individuals and these people have always been around and they've been glorified and we loved them. And what my life would have been, right? As a little queer person, like you said, to have known that some of the things that exist in me are the most wonderful things that can ever exist. And if I just knew they were gifts right away, how much more I could have shared that gift, right? I think I have the wonderful privilege now, later in my years, to kind of outwardly share my gifts how I can. But, that's delayed through shame and through external sort of oppression and gaslighting and discrimination, shall I say. And again, we tend to take that on as we're wrong because the representation has been removed from our visual. It's almost like, for me, I thought I was like the only gay one in the world and that like no one was ever going to feel this, right? And just the visuals of, I talked about this on the panel, at our LGBTQ amped meetings, I learned that there was a trans woman who existed in Oxnard, California. That's where I'm from. Never knew, didn't see it in a paper. Like apparently, like this speaker knew about them, but I didn't know, and I grew up in the same city, right? What even just these small details do for people to find themselves, find joy, find expression, heal. I just think it's powerful.
Yeah, and talk about intersectionality. I think about the intersectionality of doing our own healing and then the collective and what's
Yeah.
happening, and that
Yeah.
both of them, when we blend those together, something really powerful happens. Because
Yeah.
I think sometimes, and I understand why the community, and I'm using that as a very big,
Yeah.
broad, umbrella now, can be in the woundology piece and be in the reactivity and be focused on what's happening in the world, and all of that is important. And when we couple that or blend that but with our own healing, and we do that, we're doing that simultaneously, or we're at least able to be present enough with our own journey or with the people we're working with, whether that's friends, partners, clients, that we can know what's wanting and needing to emerge, and that both are important. Both are really important. And I think sometimes, I'm reflecting back to my own journey, and I'll date myself now, but, I moved to San Francisco in the early 90s in 91, and it was still the tail end of the ACT UP days. And there was so much rage coming out of what was happening. And I kind of got swept up in that. And I actually
Yeah.
think it was an important part of my process because I was doing the bypass like, oh no, it's fine. I see people dying everywhere and things not really happening to help the community. And it's fine. That's sort of my default because I think my early wounding caused me to withdraw. And so
Mhm.
that was a part of my process. And then I realized at some point, that's not the whole story because that does have a place, but my own healing needed to come into play as well. So it's just interesting that intersectionality of those two. I
Yeah.
want to lean in a little bit more to this idea, though, of
Yeah.
intergenerational joy, because when you're talking about culture and when you're talking about like two-spirit people existing that were revered, right? And
Mhm.
and I remember being a little kid and kind of feeling both male and female. I didn't have
Yeah.
words for that,
Sure.
but feeling it would like it was a gift until the culture I was in, Indiana in the 1970s, which was like, don't talk like a girl, don't act like a girl. I mean, these messages were intense.
Mhm.
So, how do we unpack all of this, both in your journey and then in the clients you work with?
You know, um, a lot of time, I think is to be considered. Rome's not built in a day because this is trauma, right? Like or in it, big T's, little T, whatever T you want to take ownership of, right? But I do want to, part of healing, I think I do want to validate like the individual work plus the community work. Again, culturally, I do think that's valuable. I think when we're receiving these, sort of harmful narratives, we take ownership of them, right? Like you said, growing up, being young, and knowing that there's all these wonderful things, and then you start receiving narratives. I think a lot of that really maybe intentionally is made to happen this way, but it kind of happens regardless. It's really meant to isolate us. And when we're isolated, we're individual and we're not part of the collective. And I think even for work with me as a Chicana and when I work with other Chicanx people, especially people who maybe moved away from their family and branched out, it's like part of unlearning too is to involve ourselves in community and know that that is a part of us, and we're all a little individualistic as well as collective. Like we all are. We just do it at different levels. Every culture kind of operates, differently. Reality is like, we can see right now there are larger groups, especially Caucasian-based groups, male groups, really teaming up together. That's collectivism using their collective views to place onto other people, right? The people just use it differently. So I do think there's this sort of part of doing the individual healing so we can also come back together in a healthy way. I think it's very easy to take on project what we're taking on, right? So navigating our own internalized shame, our own internalized homophobia, our own internalized transphobia, xenophobia, all of these things that we've, been given. But I think sometimes it is also coupled with shame when you find out you've been operating with that, right? So I think time is really important. First of all, finding the right healing process that works for you. Um, and I think it's very different, right? So we're navigating trauma work, right? And I think it's navigating the symptoms first so we can get to the core. But, again, I come from storytelling background. So I love narrative. I love finding out like, how do you experience your life? What have you been told? Like, what does it mean to you? What are your values? Does religion play a part in your life? Like, culture is really getting to know someone at the core because culture is very individual as well. We can go, well, I work with LGBTQ people, I work with Chicanx people. It's like working with that, you still have to really understand how people individually experience their culture and how they've experienced the world as a part of that representation, right? So taking time first to kind of see how people's experiences is very valuable.
Yeah, and you're talking about something that I really want to go more deeply
Yeah.
into, and that is when we're talking about culture and
Mhm.
then being a queer person within culture, whatever that culture is, and
Yeah.
many of us have multiple cultures that we're in,
Yeah.
right? And if we get rejected, we might reject the entire culture, and then part of our healing might be to look at, do we want to embrace some of it, and how do we heal that? And for me, I've done spiritual work mostly, so working with LGBTQ folks, they have religious trauma, right? They were told God doesn't, you're broken, you're damaged, there's something wrong with you. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying all religions saying that,
Oh, for sure.
but working with some clients who had that, they want to reject, of course, that because the healing, I think, is not to be in the, we're not going to tell someone in an abusive relation, stay in the relationship and do your healing. Step
Mhm.
one, get out of that relationship, and then we do the healing, right? And so for people who want to integrate spirituality, but they have religious trauma, for example, like anything that sounds spiritual might activate something within them. But it can even go deeper than that with certain culture, right? You might love your culture. We absorbed our culture. I mean, I'll tell you, my grandfather, who I loved and adored, was overtly racist, overtly. Like we're
Yeah.
not talking subtle here. And I
Yeah.
remember thinking, like, I remember feeling like this as a kid. And at first, in my early journey, I'm like, well, I didn't absorb any of that. Well, of
Yeah.
course I did. So
Yeah.
I had to look at what I absorbed and what I rejected. And then, do I want to be part of these certain cultural aspects? But how do I navigate that when, like, I certainly don't want to take all of that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, so that's the next step, right? The deeper work of like once we acknowledge like how and I think it even takes time, right? We get really blended with that. I speak for myself. I grew up Catholic,
Yep.
um, and then I transitioned to Christianity and and I think I still have a higher power. I think I'm not religious. I think I'm spiritual now because I feel like my belief and experience of it is kind of broader than what religion has shown me. But like my viewpoint, my morality, my, connection with people is always rooted in that. Um, and I think it's kind of navigating that. Like when you speak about religious trauma is a huge one in my community. Familial trauma and rejection is really huge in my community. Both things I experienced, and and there's a lot of movement in that, right? There's a lot of things to navigate. There is healing and skill building through both of that, like really deconstructing this experiencing compassion, experiencing affirmation of myself as a person and my identity, but my lived experiences. Because when you go through that, you survive through that, right? It's very easy to be in the closet because that's survival. This is survival. And I think we carry shame with even being in survival mode and having to project homophobia, transphobia for all of this survival, right? So, lots of trauma work to maybe deconstruct religious trauma, kind of outward shame, rejection, and then, building someone's ability to love themselves and honor themselves because that's very scary for people in a world where people aren't really giving that out for free too much these days, and really sort of be as a provider, like being the holder of hope and belief, or at the very least 1 hour a week while you're with me. I see you, I honor you, and I really want you to heal and really want the best for you as yourself. So there's like healing the trauma, like you said, identity development, because we're unlearning, right? And then learning and how that intermingles with trauma, right? And then there's community building, and finding your way, right? Because for queer people too, like yourself, I've navigated my gender identity, my gender expression, my queerness. And honestly, I didn't really get to touch that till my 30s because of my religious trauma, my familial traumas, and reality is too, I'm a collectivist. I love my family. We've made a lot of growth efforts. I talk about this is the dynamic of healing with families. I like to call it there's the heal within or there's the heal without model. You're going to either do it with them or you're going to not do it with them. And it's totally okay to try to do it with them, even if it's not working, right? I have tried and I'll continue to try because I believe that's love. I believe that's growth. And for me, I think they're like once you get past the anger, like love has to come in, compassion has to come in, but we all have the angry stage and the shame stage, so people to hold tight through that.
Yeah, my gosh, that's so rich, everything you just said. And I was thinking about a show. If we want to really do a show to push buttons, we can talk
Yeah.
about the religions that a lot of indigenous folks have absorbed that really aren't,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I just want to say that because I don't
Yeah.
want to just gloss over that, right? And that's a whole other conversation, but it's part of the conversation. And I love what you're saying. And we're kind of moving toward the end of the conversation, but I
Yeah.
want to lean in a little bit with this idea because I think there are so often people say things like, well, it's not okay that my family does that, so I'm going to reject them. And although that can be part of the healing, as you said, heal without, so I'm going to heal without, there is a point for most of us, maybe not everyone, that we do want to go in and do the healing with them. I think it's so layered because I also hear a lot of people, I've worked with a lot of people, and certainly I had this thought myself, if my parents could just apologize, I would be okay. If my dad would just acknowledge what he did to me, and that was my language at the time, I could be okay. So for me, like doing the inner work, then going and healing those relationships, and of course they're happening simultaneously, but I had probably a decade where I didn't really talk to my dad, and there was no big trauma with him, but there was just a lot there. And now we have this beautiful relationship, and I can have compassion for him. But in my own journey, I don't think I would have been able to do that without pretending. And I
Yeah.
think that pretending was another way. You said something that's so valuable
Yeah.
as queer folks, and I don't want to say this is true for everyone, but for many of us, if not most of us, there is an early adoption of this false identity.
Mhm.
There's like for me, it was an early adoption of like, let me kind of man up. We didn't use that term back then, but like, let me act more like a man. Let me be stronger. Let me not be so sensitive. Let me not be so gentle. And that pretending in itself was a survival strategy. I call them brilliant strategies, as you know.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
brilliant
Uh-huh.
to help me
Really.
survive. But I really had to unpack that at some point. And it wasn't, Janae, it was not until I was in my 40s and in my master's program
Yeah.
where the depth of the experiences of having to pretend to be someone I wasn't
Mhm.
really opened, and I was in the fetal position sobbing because it
Yeah.
was so deep. And I would have told you I've healed
Mhm.
that.
Yeah. And I think I did there. Well, here's the thing I want people, there's the mental, cognitive healing and accepting and knowing where you need to go. And then there's the emotional. And there's no speeding that up, and that's why when I work with people, I'm like, I'm here to build a relationship because Rome's not built in a day. And at the same time, we're going to evolve. Like barely learning about myself in my 30s. Like I'm still learning more of myself. I grew up in America. I grew up with American Eurocentric education. And thank you for my education because here I am today. And but what I have found for me is so enriching is learning outside of that. I'm in a Chicanx affirming therapy training right now. It's so valuable to me. Learning my language a little bit more, learning culture more. And those in a lot of that is because I need that to understand who I am. There's always been kind of things about me too that were kind of like I felt different in the world I existed in, but it's like now that I understand my culture and I'm like, oh my God, it makes perfect sense. We're storytellers. We talk a lot. We like to be in community. That's why I felt so empty and lonely at times, like though I'm away and I'm thriving, I needed something, right? So it's like sometimes it answers questions for us that like I can never answer for a client. They need, sort of that time for themselves to develop and learn how to, we're code switchers by default, whether we want to be or not. So I still don't know what belongs to me and what doesn't belong to me and what I enjoy and what I do enjoy. I learn it more and more, every day. Um, and I think that's part of the process too for us queer folks of learning of who are we truly. And I think sometimes, unfortunately, we have our authentic self in our most safest place, and then we have this other self. And that's okay also. You know what I mean? Like, I love my family and I always feel like there's a version, an authentic version of me that they get, but then there's this other version I don't always share with them sometimes. But we've made growth in how much I've shared for that, but that's a me thing, that's my time. And for queer folks to acknowledge that that is on their time. It's not on anybody's time. You know what I mean? Because everybody's also unlearning as well. I think giving my family room to have their feelings to unlearn while also being honest and navigating my boundaries, right? Like I like to tell queer people, like, you probably love your mom and dad. I think we all kind of are born to be that way, be connected. But sometimes our folks are just not able to love us in the way we truly deserve or they would want to. And I think a lot of that comes to narratives and cultures and messages that they receive because I just think love is intuitive and we want it. Like that's what makes people depressed is that we're not getting connection. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of acceptance, of code switching, safety, kind of maybe family's not where we want it to be. Maybe I'm not where I want to be. And I'm such a fan of please don't box us in anymore. I think there's a lot of pressure for us queer folks to really figure ourselves out and be in a box and have this label and be in this specific place. It's like things are so much more complex for us. I think it's just about taking it one day at a time and trying to do our best and value ourselves to the best of our ability.
Wow. I feel so full after this
Yeah.
conversation. In a
Yeah.
moment, I'm going to ask you if you have any closing thoughts, but I wanted just to kind of comment on what you said, allowing the people in our lives to look at their own programming and their own unlearning process. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about when I was born, the American Psychiatric
Mhm.
establishment said that I was a disease, right? There was
Right.
something wrong with me. And so my mom was born to believe that if you have a gay child, there's
Mhm.
something wrong with them. They're mentally ill and you've done something wrong. So,
Yeah.
like, her own shame in some ways prevented her. And she was like so open and loving
Mhm.
compared to that program and that of that era. She was, a product of the 1950s. That was her, those were her formative years. So to give her some space and some compassion for her own unlearning process, I love that you leaned into that.
Yeah.
So, any
Similar. I have
closing?
to share. My mom says the same,
Yeah.
I'm queer now, so she's like, I've heard that to be a very bad word. You're not, you're right. And it's right. And I hear you that there's truth to all of these parts, right? So it takes and even maybe to this day sometimes, but I think I'm at a better place with this where I had to just breathe through the questions, even though they were activating to me, because maybe even though she asked them wrong, she's making effort, right? Or people make effort and we need to allow them room to make the effort and make mistakes and allow us to kindly help them learn different things, right? I think we do better when we're not shamed and when we operate in love and compassion, right? And while we want that back, we need to kind of heal that internally with us so we can also project it outwardly. I don't think hate is what's going to connect us or shaming people is what's going to connect us. I think it's listening. I think it's love and compassion that's going to connect us.
Yeah, you know that I want to do a panel sometime where the only topic is what are you afraid to ask because you're afraid to ask and say the wrong thing. And let's just let each other do that because it's funny because I growing up for me the word was homosexual. That's the word that's like oh to me, right?
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
gay was like this new term that I could embrace. But I think the generation before me, maybe queer
Yeah.
was the most derogatory word. Like that was, I mean, we did play Smear the Queer when I was a kid. We literally
Yeah.
played that. And I'm
Yeah.
just like, oh, isn't that interesting? Right. So words do have power. And I had to do my own healing around the word queer because it was derogatory, at least for the generation before me. And I kind of absorbed that. Okay, this has been amazing.
Yes.
Um, I'm going to give you a moment to let people know where to find you. If you have any other closing thoughts,
Yeah.
just give you a moment for that.
No, just thank you for having me here. I'm always so privileged for the opportunity for people to pick my brain and hear my thoughts and that I could be used as a vessel maybe to, help folks in the world. Um and I do think I think I kind of mentioned and I'll definitely reinforce it. I think our power is in compassion, being love driven, being empowering to our people because I think we've sort of been flooded, with disempowering narratives and treatment, but we are powerful. And I think that authenticity that scares people, the power that folks have, So I think it's about leaning into that. Um, where you can find me, I'm on social media. You can find me at JanaeBorrego.lmft.com. I'm also on social media at Janae Borrego LMFT. My business page is on there as well. So you can find my business Instagram page, pretty much LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook. You can find me.
Amazing. Well,
Yeah.
thank you for this riveting conversation. And for me, it's been mind expanding and heart
Yeah.
opening. So, what a gift. For everyone who's watching, if you have liked this episode, please share it with someone who you think it might help. Please like and subscribe. It does make a difference. And what I want to say in closing to everyone is generally what I always say. And that is, if no one has told you yet today, you are a whole and perfect being. You came into this world as a spark of divinity. And as we unlearn all the things that Janae talked about, we get to return to that and remember who we really are. Peace and blessings, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Element Q podcast. It's an honor to walk this path of healing and transformation with you. Remember, the courage and resilience of those who came before us live on in each of us. Let's continue to carry their legacy forward as we support one another in creating a world filled with love, gentleness, and empowerment. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we're building a brighter future, one story at a time. Until next time, I'm TJ Woodward, and this has been the Element Q podcast.